Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We are continuing our look at the Crimean War from Extra History. If you didn't see episodes 1 and 2 from yesterday, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning so you can get caught up. And if you are a patron or a member, just note that as this series is going up, the next episode should be available for you a day in advance. So if you're watching this today, as a patron or a member, then that means that the next one will also be a day early until the end of the series, and so on and so forth. And if you want to become a patron or a member, links down in the description to Patreon. Definitely check that out. I want to give a shout out to James from Abbeville in the Somme of France. And so grateful for you, James, for your support here on Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
The Crimea, September 14th, 1854. A Russian officer looks out on a sea of masts. 400 British and French ships crowd the bay, reminding him of the Moscow skyline choked with cathedral spires. At night, they glittered like a city on the waves. And a city it is, at least in population. For swarming ashore from the ships are 57,000 British, French, and Ottoman troops, all headed for the port of Sevastopol.
Let's put that in perspective. On the first day at Normandy, throughout the entire day, it was maybe about twice that number. But even in the first wave at Normandy, there weren't 57,000 troops. That's a lot. I mean, that's about half as many as attacked on a 20-mile front on the first day at the Somme in World War I. That's about the number of casualties for the Battle of Gettysburg over 3 days. That is a massive force.
But when the Russian scouts report back, their commander, Prince Menshikov, isn't concerned. While the Russians may have 20,000 fewer men, they've fortified the heights above the river, positioning 100 cannons toward the landing allies. He's made an uphill killing ground to welcome them, and one he believes can hold for 3 weeks. Soon, this obscure river will be famous worldwide, its name transmitted over telegraph wires and spoken with awe in a dozen languages. The Battle of the Alma. Thanks so much to Trade Coffee for helping to keep us history-loving beans caffeinated. Though the Allied landings looked impressive from a distance, most soldiers on the beach could see they were a disorganized mess. The British troops in particular looked haunted and discouraged. See, most recruits had expected to ship right to the Crimea in order to take Sevastopol, but instead, they'd been dumped ashore at Varna to gather strength and wait for orders. The army waited there for 3 months, rotting amid a massive sea of tents.
That's a long time to wait when you're away from home, away from your base of supply, and you're probably being resupplied by ship, and you've got guys with guns and very little to do. That's a recipe for disaster, and it's hard to keep your morale up in a situation like that.
So, while thousands of British troops had marched out of home villages and cities singing upbeat songs like "Cheer, boys, cheer," they weren't singing much anymore. Actually, the final line of that ballad, "Farewell England, farewell forevermore," had now taken on a more ghoulish undertone. Cholera, camp fevers, and diarrhea swept through the ranks, infecting nearly every soldier. And men who died were buried in shallow graves, their stiffening hands emerging from the dirt after a hard rain, like a garden of fingers beckoning their comrades to join them.
Disease, up until the 20th century, disease is the main killer in war. It's always been that way. Anytime you put a whole bunch of people together and you don't have the infrastructure that you might have back home, and even back home these kinds of things happen, and people are all in close quarters, and your supply of drinking water is limited, and it comes from the same ground where you're putting your waste. These things inevitably happen.
Disease killed 10,000 men before they even loaded their rifles. And it was around this point that the British started to notice something. Their commanders didn't seem, good at this. The British army hadn't fought against a modernized opponent since Waterloo, and since officers could purchase promotions, rank often reflected wealth and status rather than ability. Lord Cardigan, commander of the British Light Brigade, was a classic specimen. Having bought his way up to Major General, he refused to live in camp. Instead,
people don't realize this about the British Army. It was absolutely the case up until this time, and it's going to phase out finally. But, you know, if you were a captain and you wanted to become a major, the easiest way to do that was to purchase a commission as a major. So it definitely favored, up until World War I, pretty much your officer class comes from one class of people, and your enlisted men come from another group of people. And it's not to say that the British are the only ones that do that, even though, say, in the United States, you don't necessarily have the purchasing of commissions. It's really not a whole lot different than that. Civil War, politicians would get commissions. If you had a lot of money and you paid to raise a company of soldiers, you would often get the commission as the captain. If you raised a brigade, you might even manage to get a commission as a brigadier general. It's just the way it worked.
Sleeping aboard his private yacht, as all great military men do. So the result was a class of military officers who were more gentlemen than professionals. Plus, no one knew where anything was in the British camp at Varna. Logistics were snarled, and medical care, when it existed at all, was incredibly basic. The commissariat, tasked with providing supplies and pay, was part of the Treasury Department and was more focused on its budget rather than the troops. The overall British commander, Lord Raglan, moved around so much that no one ever knew where to find him. Now, Raglan had been a hero of the Napoleonic Wars and lost an arm at Waterloo, but was also old and set in his ways. In fact,
so Waterloo, what are we talking about? We're talking about 40 years before this. So even if he was a 20-year-old at Waterloo, he's in his 60s now. And hey, he lost an arm at Waterloo. That'll go so far because that's really kind of one of the last times that the British are involved in a major fight against another strong power. But that'll only get you so far.
He was known for pointing at the Russian lines and falling into old habits, referring to the enemy as the French. Ironically, British troops soon realized that their French allies were better organized and led. Having imbibed many lessons from the Revolution, French officers were professionally promoted due to ability, and they had a tight hand on logistics, transport, and military medicine. Many French, particularly the famous Zouaves, Frenchmen recruited from Algeria, also had campaign experience. Their general, Saint Arnaud, was a ruthless officer, known for commanding the Foreign Legion in Algeria, where he became infamous for his massacres, once killing 500 Arab tribesmen by sealing them in a cave.
Oh, wow.
He was, however, at this point, deeply ill with stomach cancer. But regardless of what flag they fought under, or what experience they had, every soldier had been waiting for the day of battle. A moment that would make all of their weeks of disease and suffering worthwhile, and cover them in glory. Yet when that day arrived, it was a mess. September 20th, 1854, River Alma. Nothing, it seems, is going like it's supposed to. The plan was for the British to make a frontal attack at first light, while the French Zouaves scaled the bluffs to take the higher ground behind the Russian artillery. But
pretty standard strategy. Draw them here, and this is not a lot different than what your strategy would be with even small unit tactics in World War II, right? You lay down a base of fire and then get around. That's the whole idea, and that's the strategy here.
But the British weren't ready on time, and for hours, the infuriated French had to delay. Finally, the British infantry line advances up the heights and across the river. At first, the cannonballs are coming from far enough that the troops can just step aside as they bounce through the ranks, but the closer they get, the more the artillery rips into them. Then suddenly, a village along their march detonates. Russian engineers had stuffed it with straw and gunpowder, and now the British line breaks into two parts, losing cohesion. Yet things are not going well for Prince Menshikov either. He'd been so sure of victory, again that he could hold these heights for 3 weeks, that he'd actually invited the best families of Sevastopol to picnic and watch the battle. But he hadn't counted on the new mini rifles the British have adopted, giving them a range and accuracy advantage over the Russians' smoothbore muskets.
So what's the difference here? A smoothbore is a ball. The inside of the gun is smooth. That's why it's called that, smooth bore. And once it fires, it's really wildly inaccurate, even by a couple of feet if you're talking about firing from a couple hundred yards. The mini ball, it's French, and it's more shaped like what a modern bullet would be. And it's got, obviously you're dealing with a grooved, a rifled weapon which spins it. And so that projectile is spinning, and so it's just science. It's going to be more accurate. It's going to keep its trajectory much better. That's a huge difference on a battlefield when you're at a couple hundred yards.
His gunners are hurting the British, but they're also dying as they do so and are nearly overrun. Civilian onlookers then abandon their picnic blankets and flee the battlefield in fine coaches. Oh boy, okay, to lose his artillery pieces would be a disgrace, as well as tactically unsound. They will be needed at Sevastopol, so he orders his cannons dragged away from their positions and tells the infantry to take their place. The advancing Russian infantry crashes into the British, cresting the slope, sending the mauled units into a backwards retreat that runs into and disorders the units coming up from behind to reinforce them.
Black Watch?
Men are dying, screaming, as an abandoned parasol rolls across the battlefield in a breeze. Then from behind, Menshikov hears the crack of rifles. More men fall. The French have seized the hills behind them, and more British are in range. It's over. The line he'd...
So this is a tough ask for the British, right? Because you're the ones that have to do the frontal assault, and you're going to take the majority of the Russian fire, whereas the French are going to get to come around and hopefully do so without too much difficulty. But it takes a lot of bravery to launch a frontal assault at artillery like that.
War would hold for 3 weeks, has fallen within hours. He orders a pullback to Sevastopol, but most of his men are already running. Through a spyglass, Lord Raglan sees his Russian enemies begin to retreat. Yeah, he's actually behind them, having made the bizarre decision to ride past British lines into Russian ones to better observe the fighting. Had they pursued, Menshikov's army might have been destroyed and Sevastopol taken within days. But ironically, Raglan's insistence on speed had actually slowed the army down. They had no carts to ferry wounded back to the landing site, or cavalry to pursue. And the Allies had taken over 4,000 casualties and really needed to recover.
This is where it's important to note that some of the great generals of history were not just good strategists or good tacticians. They were good with logistics. This is why someone like a Napoleon or Julius Caesar, or even, I'm not putting him on the same level as those guys, Ulysses S. Grant in the American Civil War, they're good with logistics. Grant had been a quartermaster. He understood logistics. He understood how it all worked, about how you do supply when you're advancing deep into enemy lines. Julius Caesar and Napoleon were brilliant with logistics for the most part. So you can be great on the battlefield, but you've got to lay the groundwork with your supplies and your weapons, and you're dealing with the wounded and your ammunition and food and all of that stuff if you want to be able to sustain a campaign, especially if you're going on the offensive.
While scouts reported back that Sevastopol was essentially open for the taking. The whole point of this expedition, the destruction of Russia's naval base on the Black Sea, could be achieved in one fell swoop. But Raglan, along with his commanders, had a better idea. If there was to be a siege, it should be a traditional one, with heavy guns and a staging ground close by. Yeah. They would march around Sevastopol and take the port of Balaclava. Then, when they had sufficient artillery and supplies, they'd besiege it from the south. This move puzzled many, including a journalist from the Times of London, William Howard Russell. One of the first war correspondents, he was simultaneously awed by the bravery of the fighting men and disgusted by the deplorable conditions, extreme violence, and what he saw as the incompetence of Raglan and the aristocratic officer class. His accounts, carried by ship, would increasingly begin to shape public opinion of the war.
It was newspaper accounts that got public opinion behind the war in the first place, so it should not be any surprise that newspaper accounts are going to continue to play a factor in all of this.
Meanwhile, in Sevastopol, civilians were panicking in anticipation of an Allied force that would surely storm the city, yet as we already know, a force that never came. Instead, Prince Menshikov arrived with the remnants of his army to meet with the leaders of the Black Sea Fleet. All depended on Sevastopol now, and the admirals had a brilliant, if unpalatable plan. They took Russia's proud Black Sea Fleet, the victors of Sinop, and sunk it. They strategically scuttled the vessels around Sevastopol to create a blocking reef of shipwrecks to prevent naval attack. The crews and all guns, however, would come ashore and form the core of the city's garrison in the upcoming siege. Menshikov would keep his army in the field, securing the supply lines to transport food and reinforcements into the city, while also looking for an opportunity to strike. And among those reinforcements would be the aristocrat artilleryman Leo Tolstoy, whose dispatches home would define Russian views of the conflict as much as Russell's journalism shaped the British. And after Alma, that's where things stood. The Allies establishing a base at their new port, waiting for heavy guns, giving the Russian Navy weeks to fortify Sevastopol against attack. But things would not be stagnant for long. For 1 month after Alma, Menshikov finally marched for the Allies' new port in a battle that would become renowned for brave stands and suicidal charges. The Battle of Balaclava and the charge of the Light Brigade.
Here it comes. All right, that's what we started episode 1 with, was reading about the charge of the Light Brigade. That's the part that people remember most about this war. So we'll dive right into episode 4. So stick around. Let's go ahead and head right into that one. But before we do that, I want to give a quick shout out to Evan Sims and Matthew Langley. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. I really appreciate it. Let's go ahead and dive into part 4.
Isle of Wight, England, December 2nd, 1854. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson sets pen to paper. For weeks, he's read accounts of the Battle of Balaclava and the brave yet wasteful cavalry charge that has captured England's imagination. He writes, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed, not though the soldier knew someone had blundered? There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die into the valley of death, rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Yet that's not quite how it happened.
So you have to put yourself in the perspective of Tennyson, right? He's back home in England. He's reading newspaper accounts, which are notoriously wrong. Even today, with all of the information available at our fingertips, newspaper accounts are often wrong because you're passing information along through several people, and by the time it gets to the people who are reporting it, it's already gone through several iterations. And now he's writing a poem, and he's got to make the words fit, and he's got to interpret it in his own way. So don't take it for history. Just take it as one person's glorification of an event.
Thanks so much to Factor for showing us exactly how to make a great dinner happen fast. October 25th, 1854, Battle of Balaclava. The 500 men of the 93rd Highland Regiment draw themselves up in a line, 2 ranks deep, to repel the Russian cavalry charge. Now, usually, infantry would repel a cavalry charge by forming a square, but their commander, Sir Colin Campbell, believes his troops are too green to accomplish that technical maneuver. This simpler one will maximize their firepower, and they have to hold. That morning, a Russian army of 25,000 had attacked the 6 forts forming the outer defensive line of the Allied position around Balaclava. Now, 4 of those forts are in Russian hands, and the enemy is in danger of cutting off the Allied supply port at Balaclava from the forces besieging Sevastopol 10 miles inland.
So, going back to what he said about the form of square, you might think to yourself, okay, well, how hard could it be to tell all your men to get into a square? But understand that when you are ordering these things to happen, you're ordering a pretty big group of soldiers to do something probably under fire, probably with cavalry already bearing down on them. So they've got to be able to do it quickly. And you try to get a couple hundred guys to form into a square several rows deep and make it happen in a matter of seconds. It's not that simple. It is indeed a complex maneuver that involves a series of orders that have to be done in a certain way. I mean, if you've ever seen a movie like Gods and Generals, for all of its flaws, one of the things that they show is the 20th Maine training to go from a column of 4s, which is what you would do when you were marching on a road, into line of battle. And they do it over and over and over and over again because it was a complex maneuver to be able to do that and do it under fire and do it quickly. And everybody had to know their job and where they were supposed to go. And if you've got green troops and green officers who don't know what they're doing, it is a lot easier said than done.
Campbell and his Highlanders, plus 350 Ottomans on their flanks, are the final defensive line in front of the port. He even called up walking wounded in a desperate attempt to repel the 400 Russian horsemen coming right at them. "There's no retreat from here, men," yells Campbell. "You will die where you stand." On a bluff overlooking the action, war correspondent William Russell sees what seems a tiny force opposing the oncoming cavalry. Later he will describe it as a thin red streak tipped with steel. The British fire once at 800 yards, a second time at 500, and they're about to fire again right in the faces of the Russians when the cavalry formation breaks up and wheels away. Russell will immortalize them in his reporting, with the group coming to be known as the Thin Red Line, some of the most lauded Allied heroes of the war. though historians do still debate if the Russian cavalry were just probing and never intended to charge, but it's actually another unit who would get the crowning glory of Russell's coverage, the Light Brigade. Now, the charge of the Light Brigade was a strategically minor event in the wider Crimean War. It neither won nor lost the battle, but it did have an enormous psychic impact.
And this is the key here, because it's about what gets the press. So, for example, going back to what I know, the American Civil War, what gets all the press? Gettysburg. What was every bit, if not more so strategically important? The capture of Vicksburg. But because the capture of Vicksburg happens at the exact same time as Gettysburg, which is the first major defeat of Robert E. Lee on the battlefield, that gets all the press. And to this day, that's what everybody remembers as the turning point of the war, because it's what got talked about. It's not about what matters, it's about what people talk about.
And while the memory of the event and how it was memorialized in print is really what's important here, Rob did also really want to devote a whole episode to giving a blow-by-blow of what actually occurred, so we're gonna do that in a one-off following this series in about 2 weeks, right, Zoe? Well, there you go. However, what you need to know right now is that the charge was never meant to happen. Lord Raglan, looking at the battlefield from an elevated position, ordered the cavalry to charge the heights in front of them to capture a group of guns they could not see. However, he wrote a vague order, handed it to a messenger who explained it poorly, and who managed to offend the cavalry commanders badly enough that they didn't even question what seemed like a nonsensical order. Even to the war correspondent Russell, with no experience, looking on from an elevated position, it was clear that something had gone wrong. He watched as the 600 men of the Light Brigade dashed across the field, at first assuming that they would turn and attack the guns on the heights or something. But instead, they tore straight down the valley toward a battery of Russian guns over a mile away, exposing themselves to fire not only from the front, but from the artillery on the heights on either side. Russell described it with a mix of awe and dread. The onrushing formation, the fire carving chunks out of their ranks, the way each man's sword flashed like a halo of steel, but the bravery seemed to make the blunder even worse.
I don't know if this is the case or not, but I know that J.R.R. Tolkien, in writing The Lord of the Rings, was inspired by historic events, especially places like World War I. So I can see some parallels here to the charge of Faramir and his few men on horseback out of the town of the city of Minas Tirith against Osgiliath, and that desperate charge that everybody knew was doomed to fail, and most of them were mowed down before they even got to the enemy.
And when they returned, a full 40% of the Light Brigade had been killed, wounded, captured, or gone missing in 20 minutes of combat. Now, to everyone watching and the public at home in Britain, the charge created mixed emotions. On one hand, Russell's dispatches on the action spurred admiration for the British soldiers, but on the other, it caused contempt for the incompetent aristocrats who had ordered and carried out the charge. The French commanding general Pierre Bosquet summed it up. When watching the action, he declared, "It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness." The Russians thought so too. In fact, they came to fear the British cavalry, who they considered lunatics. Russell's dispatches in the Times of London, as well as correspondence reporting from military hospitals, had quickly taken the gloss off the conflict. Now, there was no anti-war movement as such, but the public was increasingly furious about the camp squalor and epidemics their brave soldiers had to endure. News that wounded soldiers were going without treatment for weeks spurred major public debates, and military blunders like the charge of the Light Brigade widened the class divide between the newspaper-reading middle class and the aristocracy which had a lock on the upper ranks of the military. Of course, it wasn't all down to Russell and the journalists. Ordinary soldiers were making their mark too. They wrote home about the poor conditions, the lack of medical care, and their dislike for their Ottoman allies. Indeed, while transiting through Constantinople, many officers found themselves upset that they were fighting to uphold a government that they considered backward and tyrannical. The Ottomans, for their part, were not loving their alliance either.
Yeah, so that's a great point, too, is that these guys are being sent to a war that you could argue, for the average soldier, he has to be wondering, what am I fighting for? Why am I here to defend the Ottomans? What possible reason do I have to defend these people and their way of life with whom I have very little in common? We have different heritage, different religion, different form of government. Really, is this what I'm dying for? Is this what my buddies are dying for? Is it worth it? And they're probably expressing that to people back home.
As their government expected, the French and British treated them as the junior partner to be pushed around, even in their own capital. When the Allies moved into Constantinople, they took over buildings as headquarters, barracks, and hospitals without asking permission, and to stay in the war, the Ottoman government had to take out extortionary loans from the two powers that gave France and Britain enormous economic and political pull in the country. Even on the battlefield, Ottoman troops were disrespected. At Balaclava, Ottoman soldiers had held the heights for hours with minimal support from their allies, with French and British troops only showing up after they'd broken. But because the Ottomans were retreating while the other allies were advancing, the Europeans sneered at them as cowards. The Russians also were displeased with the progress of the war. Tsar Nicholas was increasingly under economic pressure due to the Allied navies blocking trade in the Baltic. Forced to import goods from Prussia at astronomically high prices, the Russian economy was beginning to suffer, and their medical situation was also just as dire as that in the British camp.
And this is going to help Prussia being able to benefit by not being a part of this war, but financially benefiting from it, because now as you get into the next decade after this, this is going to be the rise of Germany as an empire. This is where they're going to win the Schleswig-Holstein wars, and they're going to go to war with Austria, and they're going to consolidate their territory, and then they're going to have that Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71 and emerge as this great world power.
On the battlefield, it was also increasingly clear to Russian soldiers that they were outmatched. Poorly equipped, their bureaucracy badly run, and official corruption hobbling their supply efforts, morale was low. Much like on the British side, aristocratic officers often treated war like a hunting trip and disappeared to lush residences for long periods as the ranks suffered in the field. Then, on November 5th, 1854, Prince Menshikov made his last attempt to break the supply line between Balaclava and the siege works around Sevastopol. 11 days after the Battle of Balaclava, a Russian army 40,000 strong slammed into the 16,000 Allied soldiers. It was known as the Battle of Inkerman. The fighting took place in heavy fog, making central command impossible. Colonels, majors, and captains led this fight, acting purely on initiative, leading it to be nicknamed the Soldiers' Battle.
Yeah, when you're dealing with a situation where those in command and control can't see the battlefield, it really comes down to the local officers. If all you can see is maybe a company or a couple of companies or a battalion, and anything bigger than that, you have no idea what's going on to your left or to your right. It's every man for themselves. And if higher ups do try to exercise command and control without being able to see what's going on, there's a good chance that they make a situation worse. At the Battle of Chickamauga during the American Civil War, if you go to the Chickamauga battlefield, you can't see more than 100 or 200 yards because of all the woods. And in that situation, you have General Rosecrans for the Union thinking he has a hole in his line, but because he can't see it, he doesn't know. And so he's going off of bad information, and he pulls troops out of one spot to plug what he thinks is a gap that isn't actually there. And in the process, he creates an actual gap in the line. And it just so happens to be that the gap he creates in the line is right where the Confederates have just launched an attack, and it changes the tide of that battle.
Russian units used ravines to come up on British trenches nearly unseen, and fighting was close, often with bayonets, and one battery of artillery changed hands multiple times. Vastly outnumbered, the Allies only held due to the superiority of British rifles against smoothbore Russian muskets and the intervention of a large French contingent. By the end of the day, 10,000 Russians lay dead, wounded, or captured on the field. So while Balaclava captured the public's romantic imagination, it was Inkerman that was the decisive victory. Menshikov would never again challenge the Allies in the field. Instead, it would now be down to a pure siege. The Siege of Sevastopol and another year of war we'll tell you about next week. Though in the
Okay, we're going to wrap it up right there. We'll come back with the next episodes tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.